Have you ever encountered someone or heard someone speak that's really moved you and actually caused you to change your life in some way? How many have had that? I did. In 1963, I heard Martin Luther King give his I Have a Dream speech, and it so moved and inspired me that it changed the trajectory of my life forever. For the first time, I wanted to become part of and actually help to lead a cause with a higher purpose that would leave people's lives better in some way. What was it about King that affected me in that way? And that's what leads to the basic questions around which I want to structure this talk, and that is, what is great leadership? Secondly, is great leadership the same in every context? For example, is it the same in a highly idealistic social movement as it would be in a commercial or business setting? And thirdly, can anyone become a leader? And if so, what do they need to do in order to do that? For the past 25 years, we've been using an exercise on our leadership development workshops where we break people up into teams of 5 or 6 and ask them to identify, each team, some leader from the past 100 years that they believe to be a truly great leader, and then to identify the qualities or characteristics that they thought made them great leaders. Over the years, many leaders have been chosen, but the 3 most commonly chosen of all were the leaders of 3 great social movements, Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, and Mahatma Gandhi. And the qualities or characteristics that were chosen as making them great leaders, there was a wide variety of these. But what I noticed over the years is that they tended to fall into 3 major categories, which I call the Trinity of great leadership. The first of these is all of them embodied and communicated a visionary higher purpose, which really inspired the constituency of people that they directly led. But this purpose was highly inclusive. It included not just the people that they actually directly led, but anyone who would be affected by the changes that they sought. For example, King's natural constituency was African Americans. Mandela's clearly black South Africans, and Gandhi's Hindu Indians. So each of them sought to end, in their own way, to end segregation, apartheid, and British colonial rule, and to replace these with full democratic and civil rights and equality of opportunity for all of the people in the constituency they led. However, they also wanted those same rights and those same opportunities for all ethnicities and all religions in the countries in which they led. So they were highly inclusive. Secondly, each of them was highly authentic. They demonstrated over and over again their authentic commitment to their cause by putting their lives on the line many, many times. In fact, this deep authenticity gave them a kind of presence. This presence was like an aura that radiated outward from them and actually made their message more attractive and more compelling, winning the hearts and minds not simply of the people that they directly led, but of millions of other people as well. Thirdly, all of them had a high level of self-mastery, exhibiting traits that nowadays we tend to associate with higher emotional intelligence. For example, each of them had a lot of self-awareness. They all knew their strengths, they knew some of their Achilles heels and limitations. They also had a lot of insight into the people they were leading. They knew their hopes and their fears and their strengths and their weaknesses. And they had a lot of insight into the people who opposed them. So using this all, they managed themselves very carefully, leading in a very steady, very stable, and very responsible way in circumstances that were very extreme and could easily become actually explosive. So it was clearly these kinds of traits, but especially King's visionary higher purpose and his presence that emanated from his authenticity that had awoken within me that dream of serving a higher purpose. However, there was a major lesson for me to learn in the way that I initially went about trying to realize that purpose. About 2 years after hearing King's speech, I began my trip to my personal dream by moving my PhD program in philosophy from the University of Minnesota, which was my home state and a very conservative place, to the University of California, Berkeley, which was a hotbed of black civil rights activity and anti-Vietnam War activity. So I completely threw myself into these activities, helping to lead marches, sit-ins, protests of all kinds, working 80 to 90 hours a week, completely neglecting my first marriage, and in fact doing nothing about my PhD program. After several years of this, I completely burned myself out. My health broke down. My first marriage had broken up, and I had dropped out of my PhD program, and I was feeling like a complete failure, especially a failure to realize my dream of helping to lead a cause with a higher purpose. My dream felt broken, and I felt I was beginning to feel depressed. Fortunately, I had a critical insight while I was recovering my health when I read a book on meditation and Abraham Maslow's The Psychology of Being, which was just then published. When reading those books, I had a sudden realization that I had spent years out there trying to create this great social transformation in the United States without having done anything to transform myself. I hadn't realized the most basic principle of both personal and leadership development, and that is, it always proceeds from the inside out. You need to always start with yourself first. Now, my personal psychology had been largely formed during childhood and adolescence by a harsh, authoritarian, very conservative father. His harsh, authoritarian treatment of me had built up a big wellspring of anger inside of me towards him and his conservative agenda. And while I truly consciously believed in the causes that I was fighting for, I hadn't realized that subconsciously I had identified racism and the Vietnam War with my father's harsh conservatism. Thus, a great deal of the energy which was subconsciously driving all that frenetic activity over those years was actually anger towards my father, while consciously I thought it was basically my idealism. So I began my personal transformation by starting to meditate regularly every single day, and I read and learned everything that I could about personal transformation from both Eastern and Western sources. This allowed me over several years to let go of all that anger towards my father and the things he stood for, and to make a lot of other internal, really important changes. So after about 2 or 3 years, I then once again reawakened that dream to lead a cause with a higher purpose. And I did this by starting a new career helping others to transform themselves. Initially through teaching meditation, and then later developing a number of other techniques and methods which, along with meditation, we used to use on our personal development workshops that we offered to individuals from the general public. A little later, my wife and I developed an actual personal development organization, and we trained other teachers, facilitators, and coaches, and all of us working together over 7 or 8 years, about 45,000 people went through our personal development workshops. And then starting about the mid to late 1980s, we began to do corporate programs for corporations and government agencies, but focusing mainly on 2 areas, leadership development and culture change or culture building programs. Which raises then the second major question that I raised at the beginning of this talk, and that is great leadership the same in every context? For example, is it the same in a highly idealistic social movement as it would be in, let's say, a business or commercial setting? By the time we began these corporate programs in the mid to late 80s, I had a fairly deep intuitive belief that people who had the qualities of King, Mandela, and Gandhi could in fact very successfully lead a private business. However, I didn't have any proof of this, and I had to face the fact that business culture and the stock markets judged a company's success and its leaders' success by how successfully their financial performance for investors was. Indeed, making profits and rewarding your investors was seen to be the main purpose for any company. However, investors are only one amongst a number of stakeholders that are affected by an organization's activities. So if a company, for example, is based on the exclusive business model, they may try to reward their investors at the expense of other major stakeholders. For example, at the expense of their suppliers, or by in some way paying less or to an absolute minimum amount of benefits and wages to employees, or by providing less than adequate services and products to their customers, or by ignoring their social and environmental responsibilities. By contrast, in the trinity of great leadership, great leaders and their constituencies always had a higher purpose, which was highly inclusive, that is, beneficial to the needs and interests of all major stakeholders. So, for example, potentially beneficial to suppliers, to employees, to customers, and taking a high level of social responsibility and environmental stewardship for the communities, nations, and regions of the world in which they operated. We call this the higher purpose inclusive business model, since it includes all stakeholders, and this became the basis of our corporate programs. However, we found that in order to transform an organization into this higher purpose inclusive model, there were three things that were essential in our corporate programs. The first of these was that all of the employees and leaders within the organization needed to be fully won over to the conviction that the organization's culture was its heart and soul, and indeed its most important asset without question. To back this up, we needed to design and deliver a culture-building programs that would reach all employees at all levels in the organization, building the culture around the higher purpose, which normally was expressed in the organization's vision, mission, and value statement. Secondly, the day-to-day behavior of the organization's leaders needed to, as much as possible, follow what we called the trinity of great leadership. That is, they needed to both communicate and show that they believed in the inclusive higher purpose. They needed to be authentic in their commitment to actually making that higher purpose work within the organization in its daily dealings. And thirdly, they needed to demonstrate a high level of self-mastery, indicating a high level of emotional intelligence. And in fact, emotional intelligence was always part of our curriculum long before that term was even around. Now, all this was important because people are boss watchers, and nothing can affect the success or failure of a culture-building program more than the daily behavior of the leaders at any level inside the organization. So to support that second point, we needed a third ingredient, and that was an ongoing leadership development program for supervisors, managers, and executives at all levels throughout the organizations. For leaders at any level can act either as an inhibitor or facilitator of that culture-building process. When and only when we had all three of these ingredients present, the organizations we were working with went through a major positive cultural transformation. Employee morale, engagement, commitment, and productivity would rise. Teamwork and collaboration would increase. And the outcome for all of the organization's major stakeholders would actually improve. By any measure of performance, the organizations that we worked with that fully adopted this higher purpose inclusive model massively outperformed their peers and competitors. Our experience with this inclusive approach, the power of this inclusive approach, was later backed up by a number of studies that came out during the past 20 years. The most recent of these was actually undertaken by Raj Sisodia, Jagsheth, and David Wolf. They identified 28 companies, 18 of them publicly listed. You can see when you look at the slide here that these companies come from a wide range of industries. They've been around for a wide range of times. For example, Johnson & Johnson are about 150 years old, LL Bean about 100 years old, and some of them, such as Whole Food Markets, Amazon, Google, eBay, and so forth, have been around for a much shorter period of time. But the one thing that all these companies had in common is that they fully embraced the higher purpose inclusive business model. And by any measure of performance, including financial, they massively outperformed their peers and competitors. For example, this slide shows the average financial performance for investors for the 18 of the 28 companies that were publicly listed with the S&P 500, that is Standard & Poor's top 500 listed companies. As you can see, over 15 years, from 1996 through 2011, these 18 companies, on average, outperformed the S&P 500 by a 10.5 to 1 ratio. This is a pretty good indication that these leaders were not woolly-headed idealists, but in fact very good or even great leaders. Which raises the next question then, if someone wants to become a leader, or especially if they want to become a really good or even great leader, what steps do they need to take? Now, the first thing that's important to understand is that great leaders do not just suddenly appear. They grow and develop often over many years of time. And I've come to believe that there are actually natural stages of that growth and development. So from my past 40 years of experience, and also being influenced by great developmental psychologists such as Abraham Maslow, Susan Cook-Reuter, and Robert Kagan, I've developed a 3-stage developmental model which underpins the 3 major stages of leadership development. But all of us have to start in the same place, and that is by looking at the personal legacy, psychological legacy of our personal history, okay? So using the metaphor of an iceberg, we can think of our total self as being made up of a smaller visible self, the part above the waterline, the part that other people see directly, and then a larger self, which is non-visible, which lies deep within us and well below the waterline. To transition through the first stage of adult development, we need to transcend the limits of our personal mindset, which lies deep within us and which functions both consciously and subconsciously. Our personal mindset is the framework or the lens through which we view ourselves, our sense of identity, our sense of who or what we are, through which we look at others and evaluate others, and through which we see the world, or what we might call reality itself. This mindset was programmed into us psychologically by the way in which we interpreted and responded to the influence of various people, such as parents, family, authority figures, and peer groups, and various events that are part of our personal history, especially during childhood and adolescence. Once formed, this mindset actually shapes our habits of thinking and our habitual emotional responses to the people and events that we encounter on a day-to-day basis. And this, in turn, shapes the external behavioral habits that other people see. That is, the things that we actually say and do in response to these people and to these events. Some of these mental, emotional, and behavioral habits work really well for us, and they become the basis of our natural strengths, and we're usually quite pleased with those. Some, however, become our Achilles heels and blind spots, and these create habits that actually work against what we want or what we're trying to achieve, and sometimes unnecessarily have a negative effect on others. To master these limitations, we need to transform this socially programmed mindset. We do this at the first adult developmental stage, which I call the authentic self stage of development. Now, we'll see that each stage of development begins by the emergence of a new form of mindful awareness, a different kind of consciousness or a different way of seeing things. And this, in turn, then triggers a whole new set of motivational values and objectives that we focus on a day-to-day basis in our daily activity, okay? And that's for each of the 3 stages. The first stage begins with the mindful awareness necessary for the first stage is actually accurate and in-depth self-awareness. We need to learn to see ourselves from a calm, open, non-judgmental perspective, sort of like being in a meditative state where you're calm, non-judgmental, and open. We can learn to get into this mindful state through regular practice of meditation, or through being coached appropriately, through attending personal development or leadership development workshops, and in fact nowadays through something actually called mindfulness training. And there's a number of other ways. But once we learn to get into this mindful state, we can see much more deeply into our mindset and begin to discover some of its subconscious roots. Then we start to have experiences or insights like, now I see why it is I do or say these things that actually undermine or work against what I'm trying to achieve or what I want, and often unnecessarily hurt other people. As we have these insights, we develop both the desire and the ability to become truly free of the limitations of this personal mindset. And as this occurs, the Achilles heels and blind spots habits begin to fade away. As part of this, we gradually begin to experience more of our wholeness as a person. As a result of our personal history, most of us arrive at adulthood feeling that somehow or in some way we're not whole or complete. There's something missing inside, and we're motivated to try to fill that in. So what we do is we focus externally on achieving things like more recognition, more prestige, more success, more love, more security, more money, more whatever. The idea being that when we have enough of these things, then we'll feel satisfied or whole or complete. But as we learn to get into this mindful state, we see more deeply into ourselves. And the more deeply we look, we actually gradually discover that we are already whole and indeed always have been. As part of this, we begin to experience a very high level of self-acceptance, just as we are, warts and all. This doesn't mean that we don't want to continue growing and developing, that we don't want to become a better or more capable person. It simply means that whatever stage we're at in our personal development journey, we will always see something about ourselves that we want to change, some warts. Thus, the time for self-acceptance has to always be now. The net result of all this is we start to experience a kind of self-esteem which is intrinsic to who we are. It's intrinsic because it doesn't depend upon other people's opinions or how society or our social surroundings rank orders us. This is an indication that we've actually fully individuated from the family and social cultural background that formed our psychology and have become truly internally free and independent. We have actually discovered our own unique, authentic self and our own unique, authentic voice. According to Harvard's Dr. Robert Kagan, although he uses a different term for this stage, about 40% of highly educated adults returning for further education fully achieve this state, but from the general population, only about 25% fully achieve this state. But this is the rock-solid foundation for good leadership at any level. The second developmental stage I've called the transpersonal self stage, for the reason that we have to reach deep into ourselves beyond the purely personal focus of the first stage of development. In other words, it's transpersonal because it reaches beyond the purely personal. This stage is awakened by the emergence of two new integrated forms of mindful awareness. Firstly, a great expansion of our capacity to experience empathy way beyond the usual boundaries or conditions under which we would have that feeling. This means empathy for people who have nothing in common with us, people we don't know well, people we disagree with, and even sometimes people that we kind of dislike. Secondly, this empathy also awakens within us a greater capacity to see the world as other people see it. In essence, to actually see other people's reality perspectives. And the empathy allows us to actually feel what it might be like to see the world as other people actually see it. Now, this mindful awareness brings with it a whole new set of motivational values and objectives, which in a leadership context create something that we call transformational leadership. So whatever the context, for example, whether you're starting a new or transforming a pre-existing team, group, organization, network, whatever, transformational leadership requires two things. Firstly, that you inspire the individuals, groups, or organizations that you're leading to embrace a higher purpose, which is inclusive of the needs and interests of all potential stakeholders. We do this through communicating, both through words and through our actions, why this higher purpose is of intrinsic value as an end in itself, not just as a means to an end, but as an end in itself. Because it's discovering and understanding this why that inspires us to find meaning and purpose and direction in our day-to-day activities. And the expansion of our capacity for empathy and the ability to see others' reality perspectives greatly improves our ability to communicate this why to a wide range of people with very different perspectives. King, Mandela, and Gandhi were master communicators of this why, and thus could attract huge numbers of very diverse people to a single higher purpose. Secondly, to develop bonds of mutual trust and respect within our group or organization to enable deep collaboration in pursuing our objectives. Trust and respect are important because deep collaboration can only occur where there's full openness, that is, no hiding information or protecting turf. And indeed, at the transpersonal level, we are not just individually creating a component of a project, we are actually co-creating that project. You and I have actually become we. Deep collaboration and co-creation create powerful synergy, where the outcome is far greater than the sum of the individual inputs. Working co-creatively with trust and respect has a huge multiplying effect on the objectives we seek in any area of work or of life. Clearly, King, Mandela, and Gandhi achieved this synergy for working with very few resources and probably at any given time no more than a few thousand full-time activists. They were able to achieve a social transformation that affected the lives of millions of people, both during their lifetime and well into the future. They had to have been fully realized at least at the transpersonal level to have achieved so much with so little. With the right business model, this same synergy can be achieved in a commercial or business setting. A little earlier, I spoke of the higher purpose inclusive business model, which was the basis of our corporate programs. I indicated that in our experience, and in a study which I actually spoke about extensively, that companies that are led by people who embrace this higher purpose inclusive business model massively outperform their peers and competitors in every area, including their financial performance for their investors. If you remember, it was actually about a 10.5 to 1 ratio. But it was precisely because these companies were bonded together around a common purpose, which was inclusive of the needs and interests of all their stakeholders, that their investors did so well. The irony of all this is that those companies who use the exclusive business model, focusing primarily or only on rewarding their shareholders, do not reward their shareholders nearly as well as the ones who focus on the needs and interests of all of their stakeholders. However, to be able to lead at the senior level using this higher purpose inclusive business model, a leader must be at least transitioning through or at or beyond the transpersonal level. Again, according to Harvard's Dr. Robert Kagan, although he uses a different term for this stage, about 17% of the adult population are transitioning through the transpersonal stage, with about 1% having fully arrived. And this brings me to the third developmental stage, which I call the unitive self stage, because it involves reaching really deep within our psychology, the deepest level of our psychology, where we sense a oneness with everyone. We awaken this stage, again, by two new emerging integrated forms of mindful awareness. Firstly, a greatly expanded capacity to experience love and compassion way beyond the usual limits or conditions under which we would have that feeling. This means feeling love and compassion again for people very different from us, people we hardly know, people we don't have a lot in common with, and sometimes, at times, even for people that we kind of dislike. Secondly, this love and compassion awakens within us a deep sense of our interconnectedness with all other human beings, and indeed all sentient beings. In essence, it's the experience of being part of a holistic, interconnected global human family and global network of life. This love and compassion and the deep sense of our interconnectedness with other humans can have only one overriding motivational value and objective, and that is the drive to be an influence in transforming the quality of life on this planet in expanding waves of concentric circles, starting with the constituency that you lead in, to the communities that operates in, the nations it operates in, the community of nations, and indeed the world. At this stage, leadership is actually more like statespersonship, since the overriding motivational value and objective is to contribute to creating a world that works for everyone. While focusing intensely on their own constituencies, I believe this was the underlying motivation for King, Mandela, and Gandhi. But I also believe this is the underlying motivation in the commercial sphere for business leaders like John Mackey, the founder of Whole Food Markets. Starting with $45,000, he co-founded his company and built it over 32 years to 67,000 people with 11 billion in annual revenues and a market capitalization of 19 billion. While the constituency he leads is the company that he co-founded, he has argued passionately for a complete transformation of the basic capitalist philosophy that dominates the modern world. And he's actually committed himself to using his company as a vehicle for making the world a better place, both in the way he runs the company on a day-to-day basis, but also by the foundations that his company has created that are operating now in communities all over the US, in 50 countries around the world, and the intention is within 10 years, every country in the world. And he's been heavily criticized for doing this. For example, in Reason magazine some years ago, in a spirited debate, he was accused of using altruism and collectivism to shortchange his shareholders. Indeed, he was even accused of holding Marxist sympathies. This is John Mackey's answer in this magazine in his own words. Quote, "At Whole Foods, we measure our success by the amount of value we can create for all 6 of our most important stakeholders: customers, team members, investors, vendors, the community, and the environment. This is our potential as human beings to take joy in the flourishing of people everywhere. Whole Foods gives money to its communities because we care about them and feel a responsibility to help them flourish as well as possible. To extend our love and care beyond our narrow self-interest is antithetical neither to our human nature nor to our financial success. Rather, it leads to the better fulfillment of both." End of quotes. No one would seriously argue today with the fact that capitalism is the most powerful method on earth for being able to generate pure wealth. But there are different forms of capitalism which have very different outcomes. I described, for example, companies that use this inclusive business model, this higher purpose inclusive business model, such as John Mackey's, that are far more generous to all of their major stakeholders, including their investors, than those companies that use the exclusive model, focusing primarily or only on shareholders or on investors. Thus, there's a great need for more business leaders like John Mackey, men and women who embrace the higher purpose inclusive business model, who want to use their businesses to make the world a better place, and most importantly, who have the demonstrated ability to be effective in helping to do so. These are the Kings, Mandalas, and Gandhis of the commercial sphere. As more of them reach the transpersonal and unitive stage, they will have both the desire and the ability to completely transform the current capitalist system to a vastly more humane, socially and environmentally responsible market-based system. I believe that at this stage in the 21st century, there's reason to have hope and even optimism that that transformation can occur in just a few decades. Which then raises the final question that I raised at the beginning of this talk, and that is, can anyone become a leader? And if so, what does it take to become one? Yes, I believe that everyone in their own way can become part of leading this global transformation, provided that they are committed to 2 things. Firstly, to ceaselessly working on themselves to rise up that level, those adult developmental levels, as far as they can possibly go, starting from wherever they are. Secondly, to step forward and take leadership initiative wherever they are and to the greatest degree of which they are capable. Remember that leadership is not a position, and there are many ways in which you can lead. Write a book or article, start your own business, become a clergyman or clergywoman, start an NGO or a charity or join one, help to transform a corporation or government agency to the full stakeholder model, and there are many other ways. In the end, we may not be as influential as a King, Mandela, Gandhi, or John Mackey, but in our heart of hearts, we'll know that we've left the world a little better place because we've been here. And then again, some of us, some of you men and women out there may actually become the kings, Mandalas, Gandhis, and Mackis of the future. So if you really are interested in following up more on this, I've got a book out. It's called Climb a Different Ladder. You can explore more deeply the things I've been talking about during this talk.